In April 1987, police pressed a square of gauze into Gary Ridgway's mouth, sealed it in an evidence envelope, and let him go. They already had a missing teenager whose family had followed a pickup truck to his house. They had fibers, vehicle descriptions, and an allegation that he had put another woman in a chokehold. What they did not have was a test that could turn his saliva into a murder case. 14 years later, a laboratory compared DNA from that gauze with biological evidence preserved from 3 murdered women. The profiles matched. By then, Ridgway had kept the same job, driven the same roads south of Seattle, and killed women police were still trying to identify. The Green River case turns on one question: how did detectives get close enough to search Ridgway and collect his saliva in 1987, yet fail to arrest him until 2001? The answer lies in what investigators found, what science could not yet read, and what separate agencies failed to connect before more women vanished. The first body was found in the water. On July 15, 1982, 2 boys riding bicycles near the Green River south of Seattle saw something in the current. The body was that of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield. She had been strangled. Her death might initially have looked like a single homicide in an area already familiar to police, but within 1 month the river produced 4 more victims: Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Faye Chapman, Opal Charmaine Mills, and Cynthia Jean Hines. The discoveries came close together, both in time and geography. Some of the women had been left in or beside the river. Several were teenagers. The cause of death and the way the bodies had been disposed of suggested a pattern rather than coincidence. Investigators were no longer looking for the person who had killed one woman. They were trying to determine whether someone was using the Green River as a dumping ground. The name given to the unknown offender came from that first cluster. It would eventually become more famous than the names of many of the women he killed. But in the summer of 1982, detectives did not know whether the river was the center of the crime or merely the first place the pattern had become visible. The Green River runs through an industrial and suburban landscape south of Seattle. A short drive away, Pacific Highway South passed motels, bars, restaurants, airport traffic, and parking lots where sex workers met customers. The road gave a predator exactly what he needed: brief conversations, constant traffic, and hundreds of ordinary vehicles disappearing in both directions. Many of the victims were young. Some had run away from home. Some moved between foster care, relatives, motels, and the street. Some used drugs. Many were involved in sex work. On one police desk, a family might report a teenager who had left before. In another jurisdiction, officers might have an unidentified body. Along the highway, witnesses often knew a woman by a street name rather than the name on her birth certificate. Those records did not automatically meet. Ridgway learned to live inside that delay. He later admitted that he chose women he believed would not be reported missing quickly and whose deaths might draw less attention. The first task force formed in August 1982. Detectives spread missing person reports, dental charts, vehicle descriptions, fibers, and scene locations across an investigation that was growing faster than they could organize it. There was no national digital system that could instantly connect an unidentified body in one jurisdiction with a missing woman reported somewhere else. A dental chart could arrive days later. A name could be entered under an alias. One missed comparison could keep a victim unidentified and a killer moving. Then the investigation locked onto a man who looked like the answer. A cab driver from Lacey, Washington, came under intense scrutiny in the fall of 1982. Officers followed him and watched his movements. For a time, the first task force concentrated heavily on him. Then, women continued to disappear while he was under surveillance. New discoveries arrived that did not fit a killer who was already being watched. By November, the theory had broken apart, and the first task force was dismantled. The surveillance cars stopped. The killings did not. During the following year, bodies began appearing far from the river. Some were found in wooded areas near roads. Others were placed over embankments or hidden beneath foliage. The locations were often secluded enough to delay discovery but accessible by vehicle. More than one victim could be left in the same general area, sometimes only a short distance apart. That clustering mattered. It told investigators that the killer knew the terrain and was comfortable returning to familiar places. The sites were not random points chosen in panic. They were part of a personal map. The victims had generally been killed by strangulation, sometimes manually, and sometimes with clothing or another ligature. Ridgway would later admit that he often lured women into his vehicle, took them to his home or a secluded area, and attacked when he believed he could control the situation. He removed clothing and personal property that could speed identification. He transported bodies in his truck and placed them near roads, riverbanks, or wooded clearings. At some sites, he used brush or plastic to conceal them. He also returned to locations after the killings and committed sexual acts with the bodies. That detail is difficult, but it cannot be removed without changing the investigative meaning of the sites. It explains why he wanted clusters he could relocate and why familiar dumping grounds mattered to him long after the initial disposal. By early 1983, the unknown killer had already developed a system. He chose women he believed were isolated. He used a vehicle that looked ordinary in the industrial suburbs south of Seattle. He killed quickly, usually without a weapon that would leave a distinctive ballistic trail. He moved the victims away from the place where they were last seen. Then he relied on time, weather, animals, and delayed identification to erase the connections. Then a family found the truck police had not. Marie Malvar was 17. On April 30, 1983, she was seen along Pacific Highway South. Her boyfriend watched her enter a pickup truck. He later said there appeared to be an argument before the vehicle pulled away. Marie did not come home. Her father, Marie Malvar, and her boyfriend began driving through nearby neighborhoods, comparing pickup trucks with the one they remembered. The search was not organized by a task force. It was a father and a young man moving street by street because waiting felt impossible. The next day, they saw a matching truck outside a house in Des Moines. The house belonged to Gary Leon Ridgway. They had not brought police a rumor or a face seen months earlier. They had followed the last known vehicle of a missing 17-year-old to a specific driveway. Des Moines officers questioned Ridgway. He denied knowing Marie. The name did not move through the investigation with the urgency the family expected. Ridgway lived near the boundary of agencies working the case, and months passed before the Green River Task Force interviewed him. When detectives finally sat across from him, they saw a steady worker and family man who looked ordinary enough to disappear into the same suburbs where the victims had vanished. Ridgway was a longtime truck painter at Kenworth. He kept steady employment. He owned pickup trucks. He had relationships, marriages, and a son. He was familiar with the highway corridor and the isolated roads around the Green River. He also had a history of encounters with sex workers and had been arrested in 1982 for solicitation. None of that proved murder. But Marie Malvar's disappearance gave investigators a reason to keep his name. Then the case outgrew every room assigned to it. By January 1984, a second and much larger task force was operating. Maps filled with pins, tip sheets, suspect cards, dental records, and laboratory requests accumulated by the thousands. Detectives, analysts, forensic specialists, and officers from several agencies tried to keep one disappearance from being buried beneath the next. Each recovered body opened several investigations at once. Searchers first moved through brush in lines, placing markers beside bones, clothing, jewelry, fibers, and debris before anything was removed. Examiners then had to determine whether the remains belonged to one person or several. Dental records had to be found. Missing person reports had to be compared. Witnesses had to be located months after the last sighting. Before detectives could ask who killed a woman, they often had to prove who she was. Even the victim list kept changing. A body near the Green River suggested a connection, but location alone could not prove one. Strangulation fit the pattern, but it was not unique to a single killer. A woman last seen on Pacific Highway South might belong to the series, or she might have left the area, encountered another offender, or or still be alive. Add the wrong name and the pattern blurred. Leave out the right one, and the pattern broke. Investigators pinned river access points, rural roads, and wooded corridors onto maps. They compared discovery dates with weather, work schedules, vehicle reports, and the movements of known offenders. They repeatedly interviewed women working along the highway because those women knew the customers, cars, nicknames, and warning signs better than anyone. The interviews produced valuable leads, but often only a partial plate, a first name, or a truck described under poor light. Publicity added another stack of paper. Callers named husbands, neighbors, co-workers, and former boyfriends. Some were frightened. Some were trying to settle a grievance. A few men falsely claimed involvement. Detectives checked each serious confession against details kept out of the news. If the caller knew only what had appeared in a headline, the lead ended there. Ridgway's name remained inside that flood. It was never meaningless. It was simply one recurring card among thousands, attached to a truck, a missing girl, and a geography that still did not amount to courtroom proof. Some sites produced multiple victims. In March 1984, remains were found near Star Lake Road. Other clusters appeared around Mountain View Cemetery near SeaTac and in wooded areas around Auburn and South King County. The river had supplied the nickname, but the geography of the murders had widened into a network of dumping grounds. Investigators began asking whether the offender was changing his behavior in response to police and media attention. The river was now watched. Search teams had mapped its banks. Reporters gathered whenever remains were found. Moving bodies to dry land could be an adaptation. It could also mean that the killer had always used several locations, and the river discoveries had exposed only one portion of the pattern. The widening geography eventually crossed a state line. In 1985, remains connected to women from the Seattle area series were found near Portland, Oregon. That movement mattered because it raised the possibility that the killer traveled farther than investigators had assumed, and because it brought the FBI more deeply into the case. Federal agents assisted with behavioral analysis, data review, and coordination across jurisdictions. The FBI profile could help narrow habits and likely routines, but it could not supply a name. A profile might suggest that the offender knew the victim's environment, used a vehicle, lived or worked near the disposal corridor, and could appear socially ordinary. Thousands of men could meet pieces of that description. The profile was most useful when combined with evidence. Without a fingerprint, reliable eyewitness identification, or forensic match, it could also encourage investigators to see a suspect in any man who appeared to fit. During this period, detectives also spoke with Ted Bundy on death row. Bundy had murdered young women in Washington and understood how offenders could manipulate both victims and investigators. He suggested that the Green River killer might return to disposal sites. The idea later aligned with Ridgway's confession, but Bundy did not reveal the killer's identity, predict the decisive evidence, or point police toward Ridgway. His role has often grown in retellings because it creates a dramatic meeting between two serial killers. In the actual investigation, it was one consultation inside an enormous case, not the break that ended it. Ridgway did not disappear from the files. He kept slipping through the filters. In 1984, he contacted the task force and presented himself as someone who might have information. Detectives questioned him. Then they gave him a polygraph. He passed. The machine had not proven him truthful. Polygraphs measure physical responses and depend heavily on the questions, the examiner, and the person being tested. But inside an investigation carrying thousands of names, a pass test could lower a suspect's priority. Ridgway walked away from one more encounter with police carrying less pressure than before. Other reports pulled attention back toward him. Rebecca Guay told investigators that Ridgway had once put her in a chokehold during an encounter. Ridgway admitted meeting her, but denied trying to kill her. Former partners later described disturbing behavior and unexplained absences. Witnesses had reported blue or green pickups near several disappearances. Ridgway had access to vehicles in those colors. Still, a common truck was not a murder case. Neither was a frightening encounter, a solicitation arrest, or knowledge of the highway. Detectives needed evidence tying Ridgway to a particular woman under circumstances that proved homicide. The outdoor scenes gave them very little that was clean. River water and rain damaged biological material. Months in the woods degraded samples. Roads and dumping areas had been used by countless other people. Fibers and particles could be common, transferred innocently, or too small to interpret. The biological traces that survived were often mixed or minute, beyond what early 1980s testing could reliably identify. While Ridgway remained on the list, more visible suspects kept pulling the investigation away from him. In 1986, investigators searched the home of a fur trapper near Riverton Heights. Reporters gathered as officers entered the property. For a few hours, the public could imagine that the Green River Killer had finally been cornered. The search produced no reliable link. The man was not charged, and another highly visible theory collapsed in front of the cameras. Behind that failure sat an immense paperwork problem. By the mid-1980s, the task force had accumulated tens of thousands of tips and roughly 17,000 names. A clerk or analyst had to code each report, compare aliases, and reconcile descriptions that changed from one interview to the next. A blue truck in one statement could become green in another. A missing woman's age or last known date might differ across files. Early computers could store those contradictions. They could not understand them. If an agency never forwarded a report, if a name was misspelled, or if a witness knew only a nickname, the system could not invent the missing connection. Someone still had to notice that the truck, the workplace, the road, the assault allegation, and the earlier police contact all pointed toward the same man. Every major suspect search also consumed people. Surveillance required officers around the clock. A warrant pulled in scene teams and laboratory staff. Eliminating an innocent man was essential, but it used time while new women vanished. When a public operation failed, it also made the next request for money and personnel harder to defend. Staffing began to fall. Millions of dollars had been spent, yet the victim count was still uncertain, and no one had been charged. Desks emptied. The task force that had once involved dozens of people was reduced by the end of the decade to only a few investigators trying to keep an enormous case from going cold. The future DNA match depended on work no one could celebrate at the time. Preserving the right samples, retaining Ridgway's name, and keeping the files intact long enough for a better test to be invented. In 1987, detectives came back to Ridgway with a search warrant. The affidavit gathered the pieces that had followed him for 4 years. Marie Malvar's family had traced a matching truck to his home. Witnesses had described pickups like those he drove. He knew the highway and the disposal corridor. Plastic sheeting, green carpet fibers, and industrial particles from crime scenes appeared potentially relevant to his home and his work painting trucks at Kenworth. There were also tentative photographic identifications. The warrant showed how close police had come and how fragile the case still was. A color seen at night could be wrong. Carpet fibers could travel through ordinary contact. Industrial particles could cling to any worker's clothes. Plastic sheeting was sold everywhere. A tentative photo identification could support a search, but it could not carry a murder trial. Years had also passed since many of the early killings. Carpeting had aged. Trucks had been cleaned, repaired, traded, or altered. A room used in a crime could look like any other room, unless detectives found something unique to a victim: blood, jewelry, clothing, or property that had never been publicly linked to the case. On April 8, 1987, officers searched Ridgway's home and vehicles. They collected hair, blood, fibers, and other trace material. Then they placed gauze inside his mouth, took a saliva sample, labeled it, and sealed it into evidence. Nothing recovered that day crossed the line from suspicion to arrest. The fibers were not unique. Aluminum fit his industrial work but did not prove murder. Plastic had innocent sources. The witness identifications remained uncertain. Detectives now possessed Ridgway's biological sample. but the tiny and degraded material preserved from victims could not yet be compared with the precision the case required. The gauze went onto an evidence shelf. Ridgway went home. That sequence is painful because the answer now seems visible inside the envelope. But in 1987, the sample was only potential. A laboratory needed a method capable of reading a reliable profile from the victim's evidence and then comparing it with Ridgway's saliva. Until that method existed, the sealed gauze could accuse no one. Ridgway knew police had searched his rooms and trucks. He knew they had taken his saliva. He knew Marie Malvar's family had led officers to his door, yet the murders attached to him did not end there. The years after the search are where the cost of that gap can be counted. His later guilty pleas reached far beyond the First River cluster. Marta Reeves was killed in 1990, 3 years after the search. Patricia Yellowrobe was found in 1998. During those years, Ridgway remained employed at Kenworth, lived in the region, and knew police already had his saliva. The exact full timeline of his offending remains uncertain, but the convictions establish one hard fact: he continued killing after investigators had searched him and collected the sample that would eventually identify him. That is where the 14-year gap stops being an abstract limitation of forensic science. It becomes a sequence of women who disappeared while the answer waited in storage. He changed disposal locations. He sometimes transported remains farther away. In at least one instance, remains were left in Oregon, a move investigators believed was intended to confuse the geographic pattern. He also learned from public attention. When police concentrated on one area, he could use another. When a victim was quickly identified, he could remove more belongings from the next. Yet Ridgway was not an invisible criminal genius. He made contact with police. He left biological evidence. He used his own vehicles and home. He returned to familiar sites. He kept working at the same plant. The apparent complexity of the case came partly from the number of victims and the condition of the scenes, not from extraordinary sophistication. On the forms, one word could take over an entire life: runaway, prostitute, drug user, unidentified female. The terms sometimes helped officers describe where a woman had last been seen or why a report had arrived late. But once repeated across files, a label could travel faster than the person's name. Then the ages cut through the paperwork. Wendy Caulfield was 16. Opal Mills was 16. Cynthia Hines was 17. Deborah Estes was 15. Lori Razpotnik was 15 when she left home in Lewis County. Marie Malvar's father kept driving roads and checking fields long after the first search for the truck. Her family marked birthdays without her and returned to places already searched because they still had no place to bury her. Ridgway selected women he believed could be reduced to those labels. He counted on the label reaching a police desk before the urgency did. By the early 1990s, the task force that once filled rooms had been reduced largely to one principal investigator, Tom Jensen. Around him remained hundreds of binders, suspect cards, maps, dental charts, scene reports, and laboratory requests. His work was less dramatic than a raid. He kept the chain of evidence intact and kept asking whether a method that had failed yesterday might work tomorrow. The case did not sleep. Families called. New remains appeared. Old evidence was relabeled and resubmitted. Suspects died or moved. Laboratories adopted new methods. Every advance created the same practical question: which preserved sample should be tested first? By the late 1990s, the tools on forensic laboratory benches had changed. Early DNA methods worked best with large, clean samples. Much of the Green River evidence was tiny, mixed, or damaged by water and years outdoors. Short tandem repeat testing, STR analysis, could now recover a much stronger profile from far less material. Tom Jensen went back to evidence collected almost 2 decades earlier. In 2001, he sent preserved biological material associated with Opal Mills, Marcia Chapman, and Carol Ann Christensen to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. The laboratory developed a male DNA profile, then opened the comparison that had been impossible in 1987. The profile against the saliva sealed from Gary Ridgway. The profiles matched. The result did not produce a stranger's name from a database. It returned detectives to the same man Marie Malvar's family had led them to, the same man who had passed a polygraph, and the same house and vehicle searched 14 years earlier. The old suspicion had finally become measurable. On November 30, 2001, officers waited outside the Kenworth truck plant. Ridgway finished work and came out. They arrested him before he could drive away. The first charges named Opal Mills, Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Christensen. DNA directly linked him to biological evidence associated with 3 of them. The fourth charge rested on the wider pattern and supporting evidence. Seattle had waited 19 years for an arrest. Prosecutors still had to prove more than a laboratory match. Because several victims had engaged in sex work, the defense could argue that DNA showed paid, consensual contact, and that someone else later killed them. The full case made that explanation difficult, but a jury would still need evidence connecting Ridgway to the homicides, not only to the women. Investigators reopened the trace evidence boxes. A specialist placed particles too small to identify with the naked eye under magnification. Among the fibers and debris were microscopic spheres of industrial paint. Their composition and manufacturing history pointed toward material used at the Kenworth plant, where Ridgway had painted trucks for decades. The particles had an innocent route out of the factory. They could cling to clothing, settle inside a pickup, and transfer again. On their own, they did not prove murder. But the same material appeared beside the DNA, the vehicle history, the highway corridor, Marie Malvar's disappearance, and the 1987 search. The workplace Ridgway returned to every day had left a trace inside the murder investigation. In March 2003, prosecutors added the murders of Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, and Deborah Estes. The paint evidence helped support the new charges. Then investigators confronted another fact. The particles had been sitting in storage for years. A trace evidence specialist later said the unusual paint could have been detected with methods available during the original investigation. At the time, laboratory work had concentrated heavily on hairs, fibers, and particles large enough to draw attention. The microscopic spheres were not fully pursued. A specialist who had taught at the state laboratory during the 1980s said he had expected investigators to call if a strong suspect worked around industrial paint. The call came nearly 2 decades later. DNA had needed science to advance. The paint may only have needed the right question to reach the right specialist. The 14-year delay could no longer be explained by technology alone. By 2003, prosecutors were preparing to seek the death penalty. Yet the strongest forensic evidence covered only a portion of the women Ridgway was believed to have killed. Some bodies had never been found. Some remained unidentified. Families wanted trials, but many also wanted locations, remains, and names. Ridgway possessed information no laboratory could manufacture. Prosecutors put a bargain in front of him. Ridgway would plead guilty to every murder he had committed in King County. He would give complete and truthful information, guide investigators to remains, explain disposal sites, and accept responsibility when his claims could be corroborated. In exchange, the state would not seek his execution. He would spend the rest of his life in prison without parole. The choice divided families. A trial could seek death sentences in the strongest cases, but it might leave dozens of killings outside any courtroom. The plea could produce convictions and recover remains, but it spared Ridgway's life and required detectives to work with a man who had lied for years. Some relatives wanted the death penalty. Others wanted the chance to bring a daughter home. No option could give every family the same form of justice. Then Ridgway was placed in a vehicle and taken back onto the roads he knew. He rode with detectives past riverbanks, vacant land, wooded slopes, and highway exits. Maps rested in the vehicle. Sometimes he pointed toward a location with confidence. Sometimes he confused one road with another, or attached the wrong woman to a known site. He claimed that after so many killings he could no longer keep every victim and dumping ground straight. Investigators also knew that confusion could be useful to him. Every admission had to face a test. Could he identify a location never made public? Did he know how a victim had been positioned, or what property had been removed? Did the date fit his work and travel records? Could he lead police to remains that had never been found? His voice was evidence only when the ground or the files confirmed it. Before interviews, teams chose details to withhold. They returned to the same questions in a different order and compared answers across sessions. If Ridgway described a site already printed in newspapers, the statement added little. If he directed searchers to a place known only to the killer, the weight changed immediately. His memory for locations could be sharper than his memory for names. Families had preserved photographs, birthdays, clothing descriptions, dental records, and last conversations. Ridgway often reduced the same women to a road, a body position, or a physical feature. The plea process forced those legal names back into the record one count at a time. The ground began answering some of the questions. In 2003, Ridgway directed investigators to areas where remains belonging to Pammy Avent, April Buttram, and Marie Malvar were recovered or identified. 20 years after Marcel Malvar and Marie's boyfriend had followed a pickup to Ridgway's house, the man who owned that truck finally led police toward the place where he had left her. The family had been right about the truck, right about the house, right about the man. What they did not possess in 1983 was the evidence required to make that truth survive a courtroom. Ridgway's admissions also forced investigators to redraw the timeline beyond the years when the river dominated the case. The river had supplied the public name, but it had never marked the true boundary of his crimes. On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway stood in a Seattle courtroom and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The court repeated the same procedure 48 times. A victim's name was read. The judge asked for the plea. Ridgway answered, "Guilty." Then the next name was called. The repetition was the point. Each name had once existed in a missing person report, on an evidence tag, or beside an unidentified set of remains. Now each was attached to a conviction. Ridgway admitted that he targeted women he considered vulnerable. He described strangling most of them, transporting their bodies, removing property that might help identify them, and leaving several victims in familiar clusters. He acknowledged returning to some sites. He said grouping the bodies helped him remember where he had placed them. There was no single confession scene that made the entire case clear. The truth arrived through recorded interviews, marked maps, drives across South King County, dental comparisons, laboratory reports, and prosecutors testing one statement after another. Behind each guilty plea sat a different kind of proof. Some counts were anchored by DNA or trace evidence. In others, Ridgway knew a location or a detail that had never been released. Several depended on a confession checked against scene records, dates, property, and remains. When his account could not be independently supported, prosecutors could not simply convert it into another confirmed murder. The agreement remained painful after the pleas were entered. Washington still had the death penalty, and prosecutors had once intended to seek it. Some families believed the state had surrendered the only punishment equal to the crimes. Others looked at the marked maps and the places still unsearched, and believed information mattered more than an execution years in the future. The bargain recovered bodies, widened the official timeline, and carried dozens of murders into one courtroom. It could not make every confession equally reliable, and it could not return the years in which families had been left without answers. But it forced the case to become specific. Each count required a name, or a legally recognized unidentified victim, a factual statement, and enough evidence for the judge to accept the plea. The category Green River victim had to give way count by count to an individual record. In December 2003, Ridgway received life without parole for each of the 48 murders. The argument over execution ended. The search for names and remains continued. One of Ridgway's admissions involved Rebecca Marrero, who was 20 when she disappeared in 1982. Prosecutors did not initially charge him because her remains had not been found, and his statement lacked enough independent support. In December 2010, humaned the West Valley Highway in Auburn, close to other Green River sites. They were identified as Rebecca. In February 2011, Ridgway pleaded guilty to murdering her. The conviction became his 49th. 49 is the number of murders established by guilty pleas and corroborating evidence. It is not a reliable total of every woman he may have killed. Ridgway changed his estimates and contradicted himself. Investigators have long believed there may be additional victims, but an offender's unverified claim cannot be turned into a confirmed death. Even the 49 convictions did not mean every recovered set of remains had been fully named. Outdoor disposal sites break records apart. Water, animals, construction, and searches conducted years apart can scatter one person's remains across several places. A victim may be identified from one recovery, while another portion remains under an evidence number because no one yet knows the two belong together. That happened to Tammy Lyles. Tammy was 16 and from Everett. In 1988, remains found near Tigard, Oregon, were identified as hers through dental records. Years later, during Ridgway's cooperation, he led detectives to another location in southern King County. Additional partial remains were recovered there and entered into the case as an unidentified victim called Bones 20. A DNA profile from Bones 20 went into a national database. No direct match appeared. The evidence waited again, this time not for the killer's name, but for the victim's. In 2022, the King County Sheriff's Office hired a private forensic laboratory to use genetic genealogy. DNA from the unidentified remains was compared with databases whose users had permitted law enforcement matching. Genealogists followed distant relatives through family trees. Investigators then sought close family DNA to confirm or reject the lead. The trail pointed to Tammy. DNA from her mother confirmed it. In January 2024, authorities announced that Bones 20 was not an additional victim. The remains belonged to a 16-year-old girl whose family had known for decades that Ridgway killed her, but had not known that part of her was still listed without a name. The same method helped identify Lori Ann Razpotnik in 2023. Lori was 15 when she left her home in Lewis County in 1982. Her remains were recovered in 1985 from an Auburn embankment with two other victims. Investigators called two of the sets Bones 16 and Bones 17. Bones 16 was later identified as Sandra Majors. Genetic genealogy connected Bones 17 to Lori, and DNA from Lori's mother confirmed the identification. Ridgway had already pleaded guilty to Lori's murder without investigators knowing who she was. For decades, the court had a convicted count, and her family had a missing daughter. DNA finally joined the two records. After the Tammy Lyles announcement, the sheriff's office said that all 49 victims connected to Ridgway's convictions had been identified. That achievement closed the list of convicted victims. It did not prove that every woman he killed had been found. As of 2026, the official case page still lists unresolved women whose disappearances have not produced charges, among them Cassie Ann Lee, Kelly K. McGinnis, and Patricia Ann Osborne. Investigators have also asked about women known only by first names or incomplete identities. Those cases remain outside the confirmed total unless new evidence changes their status. Kelly McGinnis shows why that line matters. Police encountered Ridgway with her near a school ball field in early 1983. She later disappeared. The contact proves that they were together. No recovered remains, corroborated confession, or forensic result has supported a murder charge. A theory may be compelling and still remain unproved. The investigation has continued even after 49 guilty pleas. In September 2024, authorities temporarily moved Ridgway from the state penitentiary to King County so detectives could seek help locating additional remains. The transfer order was initially sealed. Its later disclosure showed that investigator investigated trying to convert his memory into places that could be searched. The landscape has not waited for them. Roads have been widened. Vacant land has been built over. Trees have been cleared. Ridgway's accounts were unreliable even during the intensive interviews of 2003. A point on his map remains only a lead until searchers, records, or a laboratory give it independent weight. The Green River case is remembered as a DNA breakthrough, but the breakthrough began with evidence bags sealed years before the necessary test existed. Biological material from the victims survived storage. Ridgway's saliva survived with it. In 2001, STR testing finally brought those two lines together. Decades later, genetic genealogy gave Lori Razpotnik her name and proved that Bones 20 belonged to Tammy Lyles. None of those results arrived automatically. Someone collected the evidence in 1982, protected it through staff cuts, found it again in storage, and submitted it when a better method became available. Even after the match, prosecutors still needed the pickup truck, the geography, the witness history, the fibers, the Kenworth paint, the missing person records, and confessions that could be checked against the ground. Technology could not reverse every earlier decision. Ridgway's name moved slowly after Marie Malvar vanished. A past polygraph lowered the pressure on him. Microscopic paint did not reach the right specialist soon enough. Public searches of weaker suspects consumed officers and money while Ridgway remained nearby, working the same job. The delays rarely looked like one dramatic failure. A report waited for a dental chart. A witness supplied only a nickname. A body crossed a jurisdiction before a family's call did. None of those gaps alone explains 14 years. Together they gave Ridgway room to keep moving between the highway, his home, Kenworth, and the places where he left the women. The acts that finally closed many of those gaps were small enough to be missed in a headline. Marcel Malvar remembered a truck. A detective kept Ridgway's suspect file. A technician sealed a saliva sample. Tom Jensen asked for another test. A trace specialist examined particles invisible to the naked eye. Decades later, mothers gave DNA so evidence numbers could become daughters again. Those acts were separated by years, in which families received no answer. The piece of gauze taken in 1987 remains the clearest object in the case. Detectives already knew Ridgway was worth searching when they sealed it. They could not know that the sample would wait 14 years for a usable comparison, or that the man who supplied it would eventually plead guilty to 49 murders. The gauze identified the killer. Later DNA methods identified victims who had remained numbers. Between those two achievements lie the real years of the Green River case. Years of preserved evidence, missed connections, repeated searches, and families refusing to let a name disappear. Gary Ridgway will spend the rest of his life in prison. Every victim attached to his 49 convictions now has a name. The official list of unresolved women is still open, and detectives cannot say with certainty whether every place he used has been found. The river gave the killer his public name in 1982. A father found his truck in 1983. Police took his saliva in 1987. Science finally connected the sample in 2001. 14 years separated the gauze from the arrest. For the families, the wait was much longer.